Okay, so this is the e-lecture I promised you, looking at ideas of modernity. I've entitled it The Modern Condition. I think that the term modernity and modernism can be quite confusing when you look at them for the first time. Modernity and modernism are closely linked, closely interrelated. And I don't want to confuse things too much if I say that modernity can be thought of as a period. Now, we were looking at modernism as a period, but it was very much an artistic period. Now, modernity is, for historians, a particular historical epoch. Now, for some historians, they claim that the origins of modernity come from the 17th century. So they're looking back quite a long way, thinking about ideas of enlightenment and how modern man, if you like, or modern woman came about. The critics that I tend to favour position this idea of modernity later than that, in the mid-19th century, where you have various crises, if you like, and typically modernity is thought of as being a series of crises. I'll talk more about that in a minute. One useful critic talking about modernity is David Harvey. He's a critic who's very interested in geography. He claims that modernity is about the experience of progress through modernisation. So modernity is about the experience of progress through modernisation. And if you think back to your history lessons, you'll remember that the 19th century, with its Industrial Revolution, is a period of rapid modernisation, rapid technological advancement. The changing daily lives of everyday people were dramatically altered during this period. Now, for Harvey, he sees modernity then in modernism, and he sees that as an interest in time in particular and this process of becoming. And I think one of the things that we can say about modernity is its interest in capital, interest in capitalism, and that time for individuals becomes something that is commodified. It is something that is monitored. So we've gone perhaps from a period where time was something that was instigated by the sun, the amount of daylight hours you had, to factory time, I suppose, industrial time, where people were woken up, they were summoned by the factory bell, they had their life compartmentalised in that way. So thinking over this idea of modernity and the modern condition, it's a wider movement, it's a wider historical moment, if you like, more extensive than modernism, stretches for a longer period. And the critic Benjamin, who you'll have come across if you ever think about shopping, Benjamin's one of those critics, a sociologist who is interested in the features of the arcades that sprang up in the 19th century, these palaces, these shopping palaces that he liked to think about as being part of this altered experience. He actually says it's a very positive time for women in particular. They were able to access these kind of shopping spaces. But back to modernity. Modernity is the experience of living in this time. It's a time of change, a time of flux, possibly also glimpses of a future that is quite negative, might even be quite dystopian. Now, this is a very brief sketch in terms of ideas of modernity, but if you want to learn more, then have a look. The Frankfurt School, of which Benjamin is one critic, are very interested in ideas of modernity. So people like Adorno and Horkheimer, you can go and think and find out more about them. I'm going to say a lot more about modernity later on in the course, actually, when we start to think about postmodernism. I'm going to do another e-lecture on postmodernity, and I think then by repositioning modernity, this will help us think about it further. But it was certainly a period of crisis of the body, the impact of technology, how we were perhaps alienated from our environment, alienated from ourselves. The critic Alex Goody talks about numerous technological inventions in the Victorian period that really accelerated this sense of progress, this sense of technological advancement. Now, if you've ever read Dracula, one of the things about Bram Stoker's Dracula is it's a meditation on numerous types of technology. If you look at that, he uses everything from the typewriter to the phonograph. Bram Stoker was somebody who's very interested in these various sort of technologies. So if you do have a copy, go to your shelves, have a little look through that and see where this kind of sense of the modern man, if you like, the modern woman was coming from. Some of the key concepts about this period is this idea of loss of faith, and we'll think about that in relation to Nietzsche, but also in terms of church-going numbers, the number of people who are actually attending church. You've got a period of change in terms of colonial expansion and imperialism, anxieties at the end of the 19th century about empire, about the return, if you like, of empire coming back to Britain, but also other countries stepping on empire and taking and colonising our colonies, so taking away our power in that way. When we look at Joyce, we'll explore in depth this idea of the Irish question, Irish Home Rule. It's a very violent and difficult period for the Irish, the 19th and early 20th century. Everything from the Irish potato famine right up until the Easter uprisings. There's a lot of flux, and actually James Joyce is somebody who reflects on that very keenly, and perhaps it's a little bit hidden in his work, but we'll do quite a bit, I think, to kind of draw out that sense of the Irish question. You probably know quite a lot about the suffragettes, about female suffrage, but you have to remember as well the early 20th century there were a number of male voters who were disenfranchised. So when Pankhurst and other women were striving for the vote, they were doing so very much for middle class women actually. So if you look at this idea of total emancipation, total enfranchisement for men and women, you'll learn that working class men at this period didn't have the vote. We know about the First World War, we know about the Second World War, series of other wars, series of other revolutions though that typify the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. The Boer War, various uprisings in Russia, and then later on, this idea of modernity doesn't go away. This idea of strife doesn't go away. We've got the general strike then in 1926. I'm going to take you through a number of slides that give us a little bit more of a kind of an emphasis on this idea of modernity as being a historical period. It's a period, as I said to you, that Raymond Williams talks about as being the time at which there were more people living in the city than in the country. So you've got this sense of migration, people moving, people on the move. There's a beautiful film by Fritz Lang, Metropolis, which is well worth watching. If you want to look at some clips, you can download it through our video on demand service through the library, or look at some clips on YouTube. The sense of this futuristic city, what we might become, is very interesting. Talked a bit earlier on about capital and commodity. This is a real emphasis on an exchange, commodity and an economy, art becoming a commodity, something that can be bought and sold. Regularisation of work, mechanised work. So again, if you think about the Model T Ford, you look at the assembly line, think about what it must have felt like to have been on that assembly line. It might have been an incredibly empowering moment, it might have been a very positive moment, but look at what those men are being asked to do. Small, repetitive tasks, the same thing over and over again. You might have done some factory work. How did that make you feel? How autonomous did you feel? How connected to the final product did you feel? There's a real emphasis on time, on this idea of the clock. And when we look at Mrs. Dalloway in particular, this is something that's very obvious. There's two time sequences, if you like, on Mrs. Dalloway. There's the chimings of Big Ben, and then there's the smaller internal chimings reflected by St. Margaret's, that's closer to Mrs. Dalloway herself. And then possibly also her mantle clock as well, and various other cycles and rhythms that the book then represents. Technology, we talked a little bit about the critic Alex Goody, and the way in which he talks about technological expansion. It's obviously a period of industrialisation as well, the Industrial Revolution, so think back to that. Going back to Harvey's quotation, that idea of progress gives us a sense of a linear development. It's coming out of kind of Enlightenment thinking, there's a clear rationality, and we are progressing forward. Time's arrow, if you like. So perhaps picking up on ideas of evolution, that we're perhaps getting better as we're going along. What might that future human kind of look like? Another feature of this period, taking you back a little bit earlier as well, is thinking about ideas of violence. And you can see that modernism's creative violence can be a reflection of the tumultuous period and what's gone before. So earlier even than the French Revolution, you've got the American War of Independence, the American Civil War, the French Revolution. French Revolution is very important. You've got the toppling of an aristocracy, the imprisonment and execution of a king and queen who previously had drawn upon this idea of the divine right of kings to rule, ultimately resulting in a secular government, and more closely aligned perhaps with our period, looking at the mid 19th century there, that in 1848 was a period of smaller uprisings, smaller unrest across Europe in particular. You'll have seen by looking at T.S. Eliot this week the reaction to the First World War, but a number of historians really in relation to the First World War really focus in on this use of machinery, this use of technology. So it really challenged what I've just said, really, this idea of the Enlightenment, this idea of the development of human progress, of us getting better, and that's something that we see in absolute stark relief when we look to postmodernism. I think what we suspected here in relation to the First World War then is absolutely underlined by the use of technology on such a mass scale to kill, especially through the Holocaust. The third thing that I wanted to kind of flag up, and this is implicit in lots of other critics' work, is this idea of people. What the impact of this had on the masses, if you like. You've got a period of in the early 20th century of mass communication, of global communication, beginnings of globalisation, I suppose, that is certainly very significant for us later on when we think about postmodernism. But it's the impact on the working people who, through the rise of the Labour Party, maybe felt that there was more of a voice. I also wanted to think about this idea of the city, the notion of the crowd. If you think back to what I said about modernity as being a historical period and this movement, this migration from smaller village type structures, from smaller towns, market towns, you've really gone from a sense of people having a rootedness, a sense of community, and then them being displaced. And that sense, if we go back to that very early picture I showed you of the scream, a sense again of alienation. What does it feel like to be in the crowd? There's a lovely short story actually by Edgar Allan Poe, mid-19th century, called The Man of the Crowd. And if you look on Project Gutenberg, you can actually download that and read that for free. It's a very, very early, well, possibly one of the earliest detective stories, actually. It really gives you a sense of dislocation. You might want to think of that as well. So other critics who are also thinking about ideas of the masses, if you like, were obviously Marxist critics, actually Marx himself and Engels as well. Another crisis that was very obvious in the 19th century is this crisis of faith, brought about by a number of different factors, really. One of them is industrialisation and people moving from their communities, increasing working hours, perhaps in terms of factory work. Other areas are to do with evolution, so the work of Charles Lyell in the early part of the 19th century as a geologist, Alfred Russel Wallace, whose work actually spurred Charles Darwin to finally dust off Origin of Species and get it published. So thinking about this new theory of evolution, evolution of progress, so are we always getting better as we're kind of going along? That obviously undermined and talked back to Christian ideas of Genesis. How do we then think about evolving human nature? What is the best of human nature? Perhaps undermining human agency, placing a perceived threat on ideas of degeneration. Now, one of the best writers for thinking about this, I think, is H.G. Wells in his book, The Time Machine, where you have this forking, if you like, of human evolution. It's a really lovely book. It's worth reading, a little novella really, just to kind of get through. So other factors were surveys that looked at declining church numbers, in particular in relation to London, and this growth of new faiths, new secular movements, spiritualism, for example, you might have come across early part of the 20th century as well. I'm going to pause there. There's one more slide, but actually this system of uploading will only allow me to upload 15 minutes at a time, and my 15 minutes are up. I hope you found it useful. I'll add another slide.